What happened on live television that night wasn't supposed to happen. Jonathan Roumie, the man who portrays Jesus Christ in The Chosen, was about to face the most brutal attack of his career. The host had one mission: destroy his faith on national TV. But in just 5 words, Jonathan would turn everything around and leave millions speechless. The woman sitting across from him wasn't just any interviewer. She was Dr. Rachel Sterling, known for dismantling religious figures with surgical precision. Her show had ended careers, shattered reputations, and left faith leaders broken. Tonight, she had Jonathan in her crosshairs. What Sterling didn't know was that she was about to encounter something she'd never faced before. Something that would challenge everything she believed about faith, choice, and the power of conviction. The 5 words Jonathan would speak weren't planned. They weren't rehearsed. But they would echo around the world and change the debate forever. But first, let's see how it all began. Because what led to this moment will shock you even more. The Sterling Report studio buzzed with anticipation. Camera crews adjusted their angles, producers whispered final instructions, and in the audience, tension was palpable. This wasn't going to be another friendly celebrity interview. Dr. Rachel Sterling had built her empire on one principle: expose the hypocrisy of public figures who influence others through faith. At 45, she was sharp, relentless, and had never met a religious argument she couldn't demolish. Her crimson blazer matched her reputation: bold, aggressive, unforgiving. Tonight's target was different. Jonathan Roumie wasn't a traditional preacher or pastor. He was an actor whose portrayal of Jesus had touched millions worldwide. But Sterling had done her research. She knew about his recent social media posts, his subtle but clear stance on life issues, his growing influence among young Christians. "This ends tonight," she had told her producers earlier. "I'm going to show America that their TV Jesus is just another man with dangerous opinions." Jonathan entered quietly, his long hair catching the studio lights. He wore a simple navy shirt and jeans, the same humility that made him perfect for his most famous role. As he settled into the guest chair, something felt different about the atmosphere. The audience wasn't cheering. They were waiting. Sterling shuffled her cards, each one containing a question designed to trap him. She had 5 devastating attacks planned, each more personal than the last. But she had no idea that Jonathan was about to rewrite the rules of the game entirely. The countdown began. 3, 2. "Jonathan Roumie," Sterling began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Millions of young women follow you on social media. When you post about the sanctity of life, you're essentially telling them what to do with their bodies. How do you justify using your Jesus persona to push a political agenda?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the warm welcome most talk shows offered. Jonathan remained still, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The cameras zoomed in, expecting to catch a flicker of defensiveness, maybe anger. Instead, Jonathan smiled softly. "Rachel, have you ever been in a room so dark that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face?" Sterling's eyebrow arched. This wasn't the response she'd prepared for. "What does that have to do with?" "In that darkness," Jonathan continued, his voice gentle but unwavering, "the smallest light becomes the most precious thing in the world. Not because it tells you where to go, but because it reminds you that light exists." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded thoughtfully, others looked confused. Sterling felt her first question deflected with an elegance she hadn't expected. She leaned forward, her grip tightening on her cards. "That's a beautiful metaphor, Jonathan, but metaphors don't address real-world consequences. When you influence young women to make choices they can't handle." "I don't influence anyone to make choices," Jonathan interrupted quietly. "I simply remind them that every choice has sacred weight." Sterling's jaw tightened. Round 1 hadn't gone as planned. But she had 4 more weapons in her arsenal, each more devastating than the last. The next question would hit him where it hurt most. What she was about to ask would test the very foundation of his faith. Sterling's voice turned ice cold. "Let's talk about your own life, Jonathan. You're 49 years old, never married, no children of your own. You've never faced an unplanned pregnancy, never had to choose between your future and an unexpected life growing inside you. What gives you the right to have any opinion on what women should do in their most vulnerable moments?" The studio fell deadly silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. This was personal now, and everyone knew it. Sterling had just questioned not only Jonathan's right to speak, but his very understanding of the human experience. Jonathan's composure wavered for just a moment. His eyes dropped to his hands, and for several seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the studio lights. When he looked up again, there was something different in his expression. Not hurt, but a deep, profound sadness. "You're right, Rachel. I've never carried life within me. I've never felt that weight, that responsibility, that fear." His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the studio. "But I have held dying children in my arms. I've sat with mothers who lost babies they desperately wanted. I've prayed with fathers who blamed themselves for choices made in desperation." A woman in the front row began to quietly cry. Jonathan's words weren't just responses anymore, they were testimonies drawn from real pain, real encounters with human suffering. "Not having children didn't make me ignorant of life's value," he continued. "It made me treasure it more deeply because I understand its fragility." Sterling felt something unexpected, a flutter of uncertainty. Her research hadn't prepared her for this level of vulnerability. She had expected defensiveness, maybe even anger. Instead, she was facing someone who turned his own pain into compassion. But she wasn't finished. Her next question would expose what she believed was his greatest weakness: the irrelevance of ancient faith in a modern world. Sterling regrouped, her professional armor sliding back into place. "Jonathan, let's be honest about what you represent. You're an actor playing a character from 2,000 years ago, preaching values from an ancient book to a generation that faces realities the Bible never addressed. Don't you think it's time to admit that ancient religious texts have no place in modern reproductive health care?" The question hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just an attack on Jonathan's beliefs, it was an assault on the relevance of faith itself in contemporary society. The audience leaned forward, sensing this was the moment Sterling had been building toward. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. "Rachel, do you know what hasn't changed in 2,000 years?" He paused, letting the question settle. "The human heart. The capacity for love, for fear, for hope, for desperation. The weight of impossible choices. The longing for meaning in suffering." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers directly. "You say the Bible doesn't address modern realities, but it addresses the eternal reality of what it means to be human. The technology changes, the circumstances evolve, but the soul's questions remain the same. Am I loved? Do I matter? Is there hope?" Something in the studio's atmosphere shifted. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore, they were witnessing something deeper, something that transcended the typical debate format. "Ancient wisdom isn't irrelevant because it's old," Jonathan continued. "It's relevant because it's true. Truth doesn't have an expiration date." Sterling felt the interview slipping away from her. This wasn't going according to plan. Jonathan wasn't just defending his beliefs, he was making them more compelling with every answer. She needed to regain control, to find his breaking point. Her next question would be more personal than anything she'd asked so far. She was about to expose what she believed was his ultimate contradiction. A man preaching about life choices while living a life free from such consequences. The real battle was just beginning. Sterling's eyes narrowed as she prepared her most calculated strike. Jonathan, let's talk about privilege. You live a comfortable life as a successful actor. You've never faced poverty, never worried about feeding another mouth, never had to choose between your dreams and an unplanned pregnancy. Isn't it easy to preach about the sanctity of life when life has been so generous to you? The question was designed to corner him, to expose what Sterling saw as the ultimate hypocrisy of privileged men speaking about women's choices. She watched his face carefully, waiting for the crack in his composure. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if accepting the weight of her accusation. You're absolutely right about my privilege, Rachel. I am blessed beyond measure. His voice was steady, but there was something building beneath the surface. But let me tell you about someone who wasn't privileged. The studio grew still. Her name was Maria. She was 16, pregnant, unmarried, in a society that could have stoned her for it. She had every reason to be afraid, every excuse to refuse the responsibility placed on her. She was young, poor, and faced a future that would forever mark her as different. The audience began to understand where he was going, and a profound silence settled over the room. But she said yes. Not because it was easy, not because she had support or resources or even understanding. She said yes because she trusted that life, even the most unexpected, most challenging life, has purpose. Sterling felt the interview shifting in a direction she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about abortion anymore. It was about faith, courage, and the meaning of sacrifice. Mary's yes changed everything, Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. Not because she was privileged, but because she believed that love is stronger than fear. That hope is more powerful than circumstances. That saying yes to life, even when it's terrifying, is the most courageous thing a human being can do. A tear rolled down someone's cheek in the audience. Even Sterling felt something stirring inside her that she couldn't name. But she had one final weapon, one last question that would surely break him. She was about to challenge not just his beliefs, but the very foundation of his identity. Sterling leaned back, studying Jonathan with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. Jonathan, you've built your entire career on playing Jesus Christ. Your followers see you as some kind of spiritual authority. But what happens when they discover you're just an actor? What happens when your influence leads women to make choices that destroy their lives? Can you live with that blood on your hands? The question hung in the air like poison. This wasn't just about his beliefs anymore. It was about his identity, his responsibility, and the weight of influence he carried. Sterling had aimed for his deepest fear, that his words might cause real harm to real people. Jonathan was silent for what felt like an eternity. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion crossing his face. The audience barely breathed. This was the moment Sterling had been building toward, the moment she would finally break the man who had turned every attack into testimony. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Rachel, do you know what terrifies me most? Sterling leaned forward, sensing victory. It's not that I might be wrong about my beliefs. It's not that people might discover I'm just an actor. He paused, his eyes glistening. What terrifies me is that someone, somewhere, might choose death over life because I wasn't brave enough to speak truth. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Several audience members openly wept. I don't speak because I'm perfect, Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. I speak because I've seen what happens when hope dies. I've held the hands of women who regretted their choices, who lived with pain that no one talks about. I've met children who were almost never born, who now bring light to the world. He looked directly at Sterling, and in his eyes was something she had never seen before in any of her interviews: complete, unshakable conviction. "You ask if I can live with blood on my hands? I can't live with silence on my lips when lives are at stake." Sterling felt something crack inside her chest. She had one final question, one last desperate attempt to regain control. But as she prepared to speak, she realized she was about to hear something that would change everything. The 5 words that would break the silence were coming. Sterling's voice trembled slightly as she asked her final question, the one she had saved for last because she believed it would be impossible to answer. "Jonathan, what if you're wrong? What if there is no God, no divine plan, no eternal purpose? What if all your beliefs, all your influence, all the choices you've encouraged others to make are based on nothing more than an ancient fairy tale? What if you've been leading people astray their entire lives?" The studio fell into a silence so complete it was deafening. This was the ultimate challenge to faith, the question that had haunted believers for centuries. Sterling had finally asked the one question that seemed to have no good answer. Jonathan sat motionless, his eyes closed, as if receiving some inner guidance. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The cameras captured every moment of what appeared to be a man grappling with the deepest question of human existence. When Jonathan opened his eyes, something had changed. There was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before, a certainty that seemed to emanate from his very being. He looked directly at Sterling, then slowly turned to face the camera, addressing not just her but everyone watching around the world. "What if I'm right?" 5 words. Simple, quiet, devastating. The studio erupted. Not in applause, but in something deeper, a collective gasp of recognition, of truth hitting its mark with precision. Sterling's face went pale. She had asked about the possibility of him being wrong, but he had turned it around to the possibility of him being right. "What if I'm right?" Jonathan repeated, his voice growing stronger. "What if every life does have infinite value? What if there is a divine plan, and every soul has a purpose? What if the choices we make about life and death echo in eternity?" Sterling tried to speak but found herself speechless for the first time in her career. "What if the women you encourage to end pregnancies are ending the lives of future doctors, teachers, artists, peacemakers? What if the hope I share isn't false, but the truest thing in the universe? What if love really is stronger than fear?" Tears streamed down faces throughout the audience. Even hardened camera operators found themselves moved by the power of those 5 words that had turned the entire debate on its head. "Rachel," Jonathan said gently, "the real question isn't what if I'm wrong. The real question is, what if I'm right? Can you afford to take that risk?" For the first time in her 20-year career, Dr. Rachel Sterling had no response. The woman who had built her reputation on having the last word sat frozen, her carefully prepared arsenal of questions suddenly meaningless in the face of those 5 simple words. The camera captured everything: the single tear that escaped down her cheek, the way her hands trembled as she set down her cards, the visible transformation of someone who had just encountered something larger than her own understanding. Jonathan didn't gloat or press his advantage. Instead, he leaned forward with the same compassion he brought to his portrayal of Christ. "Rachel, I don't claim to have all the answers. I just know that when faced with the choice between hope and despair, between life and death, between love and fear, I choose to err on the side of love." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "You asked if I can live with blood on my hands," he continued. "But can any of us live with the possibility that we chose wrong about something so fundamental? Can we risk being wrong about the value of life?" Sterling finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "But what about women's freedom? Their right to choose?" Jonathan's expression softened. "Freedom isn't the absence of consequence, Rachel. True freedom is choosing what's right even when it's hard. And the hardest choice of all is choosing life when everything in you wants to choose something easier. He stood slowly, his presence somehow filling the entire studio. Every woman facing an unplanned pregnancy deserves support, love, and hope. She deserves to know that her life matters, that her child's life matters, and that there are people who will stand with her no matter what she chooses. The cameras captured Sterling wiping away tears she didn't even realize she was shedding. The woman who had come to destroy a man's faith was instead confronting her own. "What if I'm right?" Jonathan said one final time, his voice carrying across the studio and into the hearts of millions watching. What if love really does win? What if every life really is precious? What if hope really is stronger than fear? As he walked off the stage, the studio remained in profound silence. Sterling sat alone at her desk, staring at the cards that contained all her carefully planned attacks, now rendered powerless by 5 words that had changed everything. The screen faded to black as Jonathan disappeared from view, but his words continued to echo in the minds of everyone who had witnessed what just happened. This wasn't just a debate that had ended, it was a moment that would be remembered, shared, and discussed for years to come. In living rooms across America and around the world, families sat in stunned silence. Social media exploded with clips of those 5 words. "What if I'm right?" became a hashtag, a movement, a question that refused to be ignored. Dr. Rachel Sterling sat alone in her studio long after the cameras stopped rolling. The woman who had never lost a debate, who had built her career on exposing the weakness in others' faith, found herself face to face with a question she couldn't answer. What if he was right? But the impact went far beyond one interview. In the days that followed, pregnancy centers reported an unprecedented number of calls from women seeking support. Young people began asking deeper questions about faith, purpose, and the meaning of life. The conversation about choice became a conversation about hope. Jonathan Roumie had done something that seemed impossible in our divided world. He had changed the entire frame of the debate not through anger or argument, but through love, conviction, and 5 simple words that cut straight to the heart of truth. The message was clear. In a world full of uncertainty, the question isn't what we might lose by believing, it's what we might lose by not believing. When it comes to matters of life, death, and eternal purpose, the cost of being wrong is too high to ignore. As the credits rolled on what would become the most watched interview in television history, one final message appeared on screen. Sometimes the most powerful truth isn't found in having all the answers, but in asking the right question. If this story moved you, if those 5 words challenge something in your heart, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Like and subscribe for more stories that matter. And remember, when faced with a choice between hope and despair, between life and death, between love and fear, what if love really is the right answer?